Greetings and welcome back to our series on the parables of Jesus. Parables have been called earthly stories with heavenly meanings, and Jesus used this type of teaching throughout his ministry. There are about 36 parables found in the Gospels. Many of those are designed by Jesus to teach some of his most basic truths. In this series, we're going to take a look at a handful of those stories, but one is particularly intriguing to me. One of my favorite parables is called the parable of the mustard seed. Now, I have to be careful with this parable because it has so much potential for teaching that I might tend to dig a little deeper than I should. But even in its purest and simplest form, it teaches a very valuable lesson. So with this in mind and with that caution, we're going to take a look at the parable of the mustard seed from Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13 is a treasure trove of parables. Jesus was developing quite a following during this time, and it was at a point where he would even have to go out and sit in a boat and speak to those who had gathered on the beach. But not everything that he taught at this time was as crystal clear as it had been in the past. In fact, during this time, many of Jesus' parables were for the edification of his closest disciples rather than for the group at large. In Matthew chapter 13, Matthew kind of describes the scene by saying, "And the disciples came up and said to him, 'Why do you speak to them in parables?' And Jesus answered them, 'To you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand.'" In Matthew chapter 13, there are several parables, including the one about the sower, one about the weeds among the wheat, one about the leaven. There's the parable of the hidden treasure, the parable of the costly pearl, and one about a dragnet. In the midst of these parables is one that I really like. It's called the parable of the mustard seed. It's found in verses 31 and 32. Matthew records, "He presented another parable to them, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a person took and sowed in his field. And this is smaller than all the other seeds. But when it is fully grown, it is larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches.'" The story of the parable of the mustard seed is pretty straightforward. The kingdom of heaven is compared to a mustard seed. A mustard seed starts out very small, but it grows up into a substantial bush or maybe even a tree. Now, what's the application? Simply put, the kingdom of heaven is something that would start out very small, but would grow into something very large. Now, since the principles are so easily understood, what are the particulars? What is the kingdom of heaven? Interestingly, this phrase seems to be an exclusive in the writings of Matthew. It's used approximately 30 times in the New Testament, all in the Gospel of Matthew. So what is it? I think it's simply the people of God, the church of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. Matthew 11 seems to indicate that it's an ongoing issue or an ongoing concern during Jesus' day, which would indicate that it wasn't our eternal reward, so it must be something present in this world. What is that? It's the collection and the work of the Lord's people. So now back to the parable. The moral of this story is that the kingdom of heaven might start off small, but it'll grow into something great. And when you consider the history of the Christian movement, it makes a lot of sense. Jesus' ministry began in a rural area with just a few believers, but before the end of the century, it would overwhelm the world. Christianity wasn't some regional religion espoused by a cast-off group of misfits. It would grow and grow and grow to the point that it would have a universal influence. In the garden of religion, it would become a significant stalwart. Now this is where I have to be careful because I tend to embellish a little bit. I love the illustration of how the kingdom of heaven is home to and protection for many types of birds. But what does that mean? Does it have a significant part to the story? Is it an allusion to the church being unified among a bunch of diverse people? Is it a prophecy that the church would offer spiritual protection to all kinds of people, especially those who might need a little extra help? Again, to be true to the principles of parables, we don't know that we should extend it that far. But it does give us pause to think and to hope and to imagine. So, for now, the short story, the kingdom of heaven, is going to start small, but it's going to grow significantly. So what was Jesus trying to teach during his day? I think the primary message was to those first disciples. They had no clue what lay ahead of them in this burgeoning movement. There was no way they could have known that they were going to change the world. And Jesus challenged them here to think big. And eventually they would. Now, this may have been an important lesson for them throughout their lifetimes, especially at the end of their lives. But I think at the beginning of their ministry, especially as they survived his execution, this was going to be a lesson that they needed. Jesus promised that there were great things ahead of them. All they needed was faith. Now, what can it teach us today? Well, folks, I think that we need this message today as much as any time. It's easy to get discouraged about what we perceive to be a lack of growth in the Lord's church and the lack of an acceptance of the gospel by people of this generation. But the promise is there. Great things can come from small beginnings, whether it's at a universal or even a local perspective. Whether it's in our own individual efforts to outreach or the worldwide church's role in evangelizing the world, small beginnings can end up with great results. We need to have faith that it can happen because we have an affirmation that it can happen. This parable needs to be taught over and over and over again. We have several promises that we need to keep in mind that are parallel to this parable. The first one is that the Lord's church will never go away. Jesus promised that it will never die off. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus responds to Peter's affirmation that he was the anointed Son of God by confirming, "I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it." In other words, death will not overcome it. Now, I love the affirmation also found in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 11. The prophet says, "So will my word be which goes forth from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire, and without succeeding in the matter for which I sent it out." The Lord's church is growing. Disciples are being made and people are being reborn each and every day. Let's never lose sight of the power of God and the parable of the mustard seed. Now some thought and discussion questions. Number one, in what ways are you seeing the Lord's church grow today? Number two, what are the statistics saying about the growth of the church in the United States? And what are they saying about the growth of the church in the rest of the world? Number three, how can understanding this parable empower our evangelism?